The city of Ravenshade stirred awake long before its people wanted to. The skyline, framed with steel and glass towers, glimmered under the weak gray light of dawn. Judge Evelyn Marston drove toward the courthouse with her windows slightly cracked, hearing the distant hum of sirens and delivery trucks. She had lived her entire life in this city long enough to watch it grow prosperous in some corners and poisoned in others. Ravenshade was a place where justice was promised but not always served evenly. Evelyn became a judge because she wanted to fix that imbalance, but some days it felt like applying a bandage to a wound that had no intention of closing. As she listened to the morning broadcast, one headline caught her ear. A local mechanic and business owner, Noah Carter, had been arrested late the previous night on suspicion of involvement in stolen vehicles and for resisting arrest. The arresting officer was Bradley Knox, a name that made the judge tighten her grip on the steering wheel. Knox had been in her courtroom before, always surrounded by whispers, rumors, complaints that never grew teeth. He walked like a man who believed accountability was meant for other people, never himself. The allegations of profiling, aggression, and questionable arrests stacked high, but each complaint died quietly before reaching consequence. Evelyn knew patterns when she saw them, and this man was a pattern carved in stone. The courtroom was unusually crowded when she entered. Reporters filled the last two rows, their cameras banned, but their pens hungry. Something about Knox attracted the media. Some saw him as a hero, others as a danger dressed in uniform. Noah sat beside his attorney, Alicia Voss, a young but sharp defender with the kind of fire the system hadn't yet extinguished. Noah, by contrast, looked exhausted, his shirt collar creased, his eyes carrying the weight of a night spent in handcuffs rather than sleep. Evelyn called the room to order, her voice echoing across the varnished benches and marbled floor. The case began like many others, routine, procedural. Knox recounted the arrest with rehearsed confidence, describing how he had responded to an anonymous tip about a stolen vehicle ring and found Noah working on a sedan late at night. According to Knox, Noah acted defensively, refused to comply, displayed aggression, and attempted to flee. Listening, Evelyn noted the officer's tone. It wasn't the tone of someone relaying fact. It was the tone of someone performing a role he believed he played well. Alicia rose to counter, presenting that Noah was working on a regular customer's car, supported by receipts and timestamps. Knox dismissed the documentation with a condescending shrug and an insinuation that anyone could print receipts. Noah finally spoke for himself, stating he complied, raised his hands, and was immediately grabbed and restrained without resistance. His voice was steady but wounded, as if recounting disbelief more than fear. The pivot point came when Alicia announced that there was surveillance footage. For the first time, Knox's expression faltered, not by much, but enough for Evelyn, trained to read juries and liars alike, to notice. The footage played on the wide courtroom monitor, a grainy nighttime recording from a corner camera attached to Noah's shop. The video showed exactly what Noah claimed, him calmly explaining, hands raised, while Knox screamed, "Stop resisting," at a man who wasn't resisting anything. The room felt like it leaned forward collectively. Knox responded with denial, questioning angles and editing, but his voice carried less certainty. Evelyn pressed him, noting that the video contradicted his sworn statement. Knox reacted with sarcasm, stating people, like Noah, knew how to act innocent thanks to the internet. The phrase hit the courtroom like broken glass skidding across concrete. Alicia immediately motioned for the language to be recorded as discriminatory, and Evelyn agreed. Evelyn asked Knox directly what he meant by people like him. Knox hesitated but hid behind vague references to behavior, attitude, and background. Alicia pinpointed the implication race. Knox danced around denial, but the implication was clear enough to stain the air. Despite the damning footage, something felt incomplete. Knox was too calm, too certain, as if he believed more pieces existed that no one else knew about. Evelyn dismissed the court for recess to review notes privately. As she entered her chambers, her clerk, Marcus, approached with urgency and handed her a tablet. Another video, a second angle. This one from across the street, a wider frame, capturing Knox before he even approached Noah. The audio was faint but recoverable. Knox spoke into his radio before confronting Noah, unaware of the distant camera capturing his words. "I've got a guy here fixing a car. Doesn't look like it belongs to him. Yeah, blackmail. I'll find something." The sentence hit Evelyn like a punch. It wasn't suspicion. It was intent. Knox didn't observe a crime, he hunted for one. And in that moment, something crystallized for Evelyn Marston. This case was no longer a matter of false arrest or misconduct. It was an echo of a system that allowed officers like Knox to stuff violence into the legal fabric and call it duty. Evelyn knew exposing him would rattle more than just Knox. It would rattle the department, the city, and all those who believed accountability ended where the uniform began. The truth in her hands was powerful but dangerous, and power always created enemies. When Evelyn looked up from the tablet, her reflection in the dark glass window stared back stern, resolved, afraid, but unwilling to yield. She didn't just have evidence. She had the match and the fuse. And when court resumed, the fire would start. When court reconvened, there was a shift in the atmosphere, not loud or visible, but a tension threaded through the room like an invisible wire. Evelyn walked with composed steps, yet there was a renewed sternness in her eyes. She had replayed that second video multiple times during recess, memorizing the officer's careless voice, the casual racism, the predetermined intent. She was no stranger to injustice-wearing badges, but this time the evidence was undeniable, captured in sight and sound. Still, Evelyn had learned long ago that courts weren't just arenas for truth. They were battlegrounds for narratives. Whoever controlled the story often controlled the verdict. Knox believed the narrative was his to write. She intended to prove otherwise. Officer Bradley Knox sat back in the witness chair with a confidence that annoyed Evelyn more now that she knew what lay beneath it. His attorney, a stern man named Conrad Holley, leaned forward as if tethered to Knox by unspoken loyalty. Holley was known for representing police officers in difficult cases and often succeeded by reframing abuse as necessary force and misconduct as protocol. It was his specialty turning wolves into sheepdogs through wordplay. Elijah rose before Holley could speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "we request to enter new video evidence into the record. Footage captured from a business across the street at the time of the arrest." Hall stood abruptly. "Objection. If this is newly obtained, it must be verified before." Evelyn lifted a hand, silencing the courtroom. "Mr. Holley, the request is to introduce evidence, not to rule on its credibility." "Sit for now." "Proceed, Ms. Voss." The second video appeared on the monitor. The room leaned in reporters' pens, paused mid-air. This wasn't just the previously seen footage of Noah raising his hands. This was the prelude. Knox talking into his radio, lacing assumptions and prejudice into what should have been observation and procedure. The damning phrase echoed across the speakers. Blackmail. "I'll find something." A collective inhale filled the courtroom. Knox sat perfectly still, but his cheek twitched, the smallest fracture in his marble composure. Evelyn watched the jury. Though this wasn't a jury trial, their reactions had value. Shock, distaste, uncertainty. The gallery murmured, but her gavel cracked the air before voices turned into commotion. Holley rose again, this time slower. "Your Honor, this footage is being interpreted out of context." Evelyn's tone was surgical. "Then provide the proper context, Mr. Holley." Holley placed his palms against the table with the confidence of a seasoned attorney. Officer Knox received an anonymous tip regarding stolen vehicles and potential illegal activity at night. "I'll find something" indicates commitment to investigating, not prejudice. Alicia countered before Holley inhaled. That explanation might work if he had said, "I'll find the truth," or "I'll investigate," but he didn't. He said he'll find something. That implies intent to assign criminality before evidence existed. And the reference to race. Race, Holly cut sharply, was a physical description. Nothing more. Noah shifted a controlled frustration in his posture. The courtroom had become a game of linguistic gymnastics, Hale twisting phrases into benign shadows. But words meant what they meant, especially when the speaker carried a badge and authority to cage another person. Evelyn leaned forward. "Officer Knox, please stand." Knox obeyed with reluctant precision. "Did you receive a tip specifying the suspect's race?" she asked. Knox hesitated. A flicker of calculation passed behind his eyes. "No, Your Honor. The anonymous tip referenced a late-night vehicle situation." "No description. Then why did you identify Mr. Carter's race in your radio communication?" "To describe the individual observed on site," Knox replied, rehearsed and emotionless. Evelyn nodded but did not break eye contact. His answers were clean but hollow. She'd seen enough defendants and witnesses to differentiate truth from survival. Alicia continued. "Officer Knox, are you aware that Mr. Carter is a registered business owner with a clean record, operating legally?" Knox's lip curled. "Clean record doesn't mean clean hands." Gasps rippled like a wave. Evelyn's voice dropped into steel. This court is not a stage for unsubstantiated claims. If you have evidence, present it. If you do not, keep speculation to yourself. Knox remained standing, jaw tight. Alicia approached with precise steps. "Officer Knox, do you believe black men working on cars late at night are more likely to be criminals?" Holly shot up. "Objection." "Withdrawn," Alicia said, but her words had already landed, echoing where objections couldn't reach. Evelyn released Knox from the stand, but as he sat, Noah's eyes locked onto the officer hurt, battling anger. Noah wasn't naive. This wasn't about a car or a receipt or a late-night shift. This was about suspicion sewn into skin. When court recessed for lunch, the hallway exploded with reporters. Alicia shielded Noah while Holly spoke aggressively to cameras about bias against law enforcement. Knox, flanked by two officers, walked with feigned stoicism, but his strides were tight. Perception was shifting, he knew it. Noah and Alicia retreated into a side conference room. Evelyn, watching through a narrow window by her chamber door, noticed something she hadn't before: fear. Genuine, human fear on Noah's face. Not fear of prison. Fear of being swallowed by a system he didn't build but couldn't outrun. Inside the judge's chambers, Evelyn closed the door behind her and exhaled deeply. Judges weren't supposed to feel. But she did: anger, disappointment, exhaustion. She knew exposing one officer wouldn't fix decades of damage, but silence was complicity dressed as neutrality. Marcus entered quietly with a file. "Judge." "This might get bigger. What is it?" she asked. "Knox's complaint record." "The ones the department dismissed." He handed her a stack too thick for comfort. "Excessive force, profiling, intimidation, disrespect. Most marked unsubstantiated, or closed due to insufficient evidence. But one complaint near the bottom caught her eye different from the rest. A name she recognized. Elias Ward, a veteran officer. Respected, decorated, and recently retired early without explanation. He had filed a formal report stating Knox falsified statements in an arrest 3 years prior. The report ended abruptly, followed by a note: internal conflict resolved. Resolved, meaning buried. Marcus spoke softly. "Elias might talk if someone finally listens." Evelyn looked down at the file. The courtroom battle had begun, but it was clear now. Knox was not acting alone, and the truth wasn't a single spark. It was a wildfire waiting for oxygen, and she was about to open every window. Evelyn returned to her chambers after lunch with a resolve sharper than the edge of a scalpel. Knox's casual racism, captured on video, was not only unethical, it was criminal. But in the courtroom, she needed more than videos. She needed context, corroboration, and the ability to make the entire system see what had been hidden behind blue uniforms for years. She opened the file Marcus had handed her earlier, scanning complaint after complaint against Knox. Most were buried in paperwork labeled unsubstantiated, dismissed quietly, leaving Knox free to continue his pattern unchecked. But the complaint filed by Elias Ward, a decorated veteran, glowed like a neon sign amid the dust of forgotten cases. Ward had noted discrepancies in Knox's arrest reports and his habit of targeting black men under the pretense of investigating legitimate crimes. The internal investigation had been closed, his warnings swept aside. That closure was not justice, it was permission. Evelyn made a mental note. She needed Ward, or at least his written testimony, to reveal Knox's long-term pattern. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Knox and Hall were regrouping. Hallway whispered into Knox's ear, his words like a shield. "Don't admit anything. Stick to procedure. You're untouchable unless she catches you off guard." Knox nodded, though his confidence had thinned. He had underestimated Evelyn once. He would not underestimate her twice. But the fear of exposure had a way of seeping into even the thickest armor. Knox's veneer was cracking, and Evelyn could smell it. Back on the defendant's side, Alicia prepared Noah. She whispered strategies, emphasizing calm, patience, and restraint. Noah's role was simple: stay truthful, stay composed, and let the facts speak. He did not have a badge, a gun, or institutional power, but he had evidence, witnesses, and the moral high ground. For the first time, he felt that perhaps the scales might tip in his favor. The fear that had gnawed at him the previous night now coexisted with a fragile hope. Hope was dangerous, but it was better than despair. When court resumed, Evelyn called the next session to order. Her voice was firm, measured, and unwavering. "We will proceed with additional testimony." She signaled Alicia to introduce the first witness, Elias Ward, via remote video. Ward, calm and deliberate, spoke directly to the court, recounting Knox's history of targeting black men, filing inconsistent reports, and manipulating circumstances to justify arrests. Ward's words were careful, evidence-based, and precise, careful to avoid hearsay, but damning in their implications. Knox's jaw twitched. Halley tried to interrupt, citing prejudicial testimony, but Evelyn raised her hand. "Let him finish," she said, her gaze like a blade. The courtroom leaned in. Ward finished with one line that cut deeper than any argument could. "I reported this because it is not justice when bias masquerades as law." Noah sat upright, listening. Every accusation Knox had leveled against him was unraveling, thread by thread. Knox, for his part, maintained a stoic face, but Evelyn noted the micro-expressions, a twitch of the eye, a tightened jaw, a flicker of hesitation. Even the most confident lie carries subtle cracks. Evelyn stored each one mentally, planning how she would use them in cross-examination. Truth, when positioned correctly, is a weapon sharper than any gavel. Alicia then submitted additional evidence. Timestamps from Noah's auto shop surveillance system corroborating his whereabouts, receipts proving ownership and legitimate repairs, and audio recordings of calls with clients during the night in question. Each piece individually was strong. Together, they formed an airtight narrative. Halley objected repeatedly, arguing procedural violations and questions of authenticity, but Evelyn's patience held. Her rulings were deliberate, punctuated with reminders that the court was tasked with uncovering truth, not dismissing it out of hand. Knox's confidence dwindled with each ruling. He realized the tide was turning. Then came the pivotal moment. Evelyn called Knox back to the stand. The courtroom fell into a tense silence, the kind that weighed heavily on every person present. "Officer Knox," she began, her tone even but deadly, "you previously stated that you identified Mr. Carter by race in your radio communication." Is that correct? Knox hesitated, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared in his eyes. He nodded. Evelyn leaned forward. Why did you feel the need to mention race? Please explain the relevance to the investigation, Knox stammered, fumbling over his words. It was a description. For identification purposes, he said. His voice carried the tremor of someone grasping for legitimacy. Evelyn held his gaze, letting the silence do its work. Silence is a powerful interrogator. Knox shifted in his chair, and the room felt heavier with each passing second. The next question cut deeper. Were your actions toward Mr. Carter influenced by assumptions about race or criminality? Knox's attempt to deflect fell flat. The evidence on screen, the audio recording, and Ward's testimony converged to make evasion impossible. He swallowed. No, it was procedural, he stammered. Evelyn nodded slightly, aware that she had planted the seed of exposure. The court would see the cracks, even if Knox could not articulate them fully. Integrity in the legal system is as fragile as a pane of glass. A small, deliberate pressure applied in the right place can shatter the illusion of authority. Outside the courtroom, the press sensed the change in momentum. Reporters whispered among themselves, pens poised, waiting for a misstep. Knox's behavior had always invited scrutiny, but now the scrutiny had substance. The public could feel it, the shift from story to revelation, from complaint to confirmed misconduct. Noah's family and friends watched anxiously, knowing that while evidence could win a case, it could not erase the emotional toll of a night spent under a badge's heavy shadow. By the end of the day, Evelyn called for another recess, giving herself and the legal teams time to review evidence and prepare closing strategies. But even as she stepped out of the courtroom, she knew the battle was only beginning. Knox's pattern of behavior extended far beyond one arrest. The fight for accountability would be personal, systemic, and far-reaching. Evelyn felt the weight of responsibility settle like armor across her shoulders. She was no longer judging a single incident. She was confronting a culture of bias entrenched in law enforcement. And she would not back down. Back in her chambers, Evelyn reviewed the day's proceedings, mapping the next steps with precision. She would cross-reference Knox's previous arrests, identify patterns, and prepare the court to confront not just his actions, but the systemic support that allowed them. Justice was more than a verdict. It was exposure, accountability, and ultimately change. Evelyn Marston had committed herself to that path, and she knew there would be resistance. Knox would not go quietly, and the department would not welcome the truth. But for Noah, for those silenced for years, and for the integrity of the court, Evelyn would push forward. The next session promised confrontation, revelations, and the beginnings of reckoning. And somewhere, deep inside her, Evelyn allowed herself a sliver of hope. Hope that one day the badge would signify protection, not fear, justice, not oppression, truth, not assumption. The next morning, courtroom 9B buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Reporters filled every available seat, the clacking of keyboards and scribbling of pens forming a low hum beneath the procedural announcements. Knox sat at the front, his uniform immaculate, his expression controlled, but Evelyn could see the subtle shift. The confidence he had carried for years was fraying, thread by thread. The courtroom was no longer a stage for his performance. It was an arena where evidence and truth had the power to strip away pretense. Noah, seated with Alicia, looked more composed than yesterday, but the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable. He had lived through a night of fear and humiliation, and now that fear was tempered by the glimmer of validation. Justice, it seemed, was inching closer. Evelyn called the court to order, her voice carrying that rare mixture of authority and calm that silenced murmurs instantly. She began by asking Alicia to present additional documentation supporting Noah's claims. Alicia rose, moving with precision and purpose. laying out client records, timestamps, and detailed invoices that traced every interaction Noah had with customers the night of the alleged incident. Each document was a thread, but together they wove a tapestry of truth that directly contradicted Knox's narrative. The files were meticulously organized, and as they were displayed on the monitor, even Knox could not refute the sequence of events without appearing blatantly dishonest. The visual evidence was damning, leaving little room for his habitual deflections. Then Evelyn shifted the focus. "Officer Knox," she began, her tone measured but heavy with expectation. "You have previously stated that Mr. Carter acted aggressively and attempted to flee. Do you maintain that claim?" Knox straightened in his chair, his fingers tightening slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, though the conviction in his voice had less depth than before. Evelyn leaned forward, a subtle but deliberate gesture of authority. "Please explain specifically how Mr. Carter resisted when the surveillance footage clearly shows him complying with all verbal and physical instructions." Knox's face twitched. The video evidence he had dismissed the day before now confronted him unflinchingly. He muttered, He seemed tense." "I interpreted that as resistance." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Tension, she thought silently, was not a crime. Interpretation is not justification. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. Hawley interjected, attempting to frame Knox's observations as instinctive law enforcement judgment, but Evelyn cut him off sharply. "We are not discussing subjective impressions. We are discussing verifiable actions captured on video and corroborated by third-party testimony." She allowed the pause to stretch, letting the weight of her words settle on Knox's shoulders. The officer fidgeted, aware that the tide of perception was turning irrevocably against him. Evelyn then directed the court's attention to the testimony of Elias Ward, whose written complaints and recorded statements were now being examined alongside Knox's current defense. Ward had carefully documented Knox's pattern of targeting black men under flimsy pretenses, his manipulation of arrest reports, and his use of authority as leverage for personal judgment rather than public safety. Each example was methodically presented by Alicia, who guided the court through months of prior complaints and internal investigations dismissed as unsubstantiated. The cumulative effect was devastating. Knox's conduct was not isolated. It was a repeated, documented pattern. Noah's own statements were next. Under Alicia's guidance, he calmly recounted the events of that night, his interactions with Knox, the precise sequence of his actions, and his attempts to comply while being falsely accused. Unlike Knox, whose authority could shield him from casual scrutiny, Noah's words carried the weight of lived experience. There was no exaggeration, no deflection, only clear, factual recollection. As he spoke, Evelyn observed Knox closely. The officer's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, a flicker of unease betraying the inner acknowledgement that the truth was being revealed, piece by piece, under the court's scrutiny. Then came the pivotal moment, Evelyn's strategic cross-examination. She leaned forward, her tone deliberate, and addressed Knox directly. "Officer Knox, when you made your initial radio communication regarding Mr. Carter, you mentioned his race. Can you explain why that detail was relevant to the alleged crime?" Knox hesitated, a subtle but telling sign that even rehearsed defenses had limits. It was descriptive. "For identification," he said, but the conviction was thin. Evelyn pressed further. "So the decision to approach Mr. Carter with heightened suspicion was influenced by his race?" Knox's mouth opened, then closed, and he murmured, "I did what I thought necessary." Evelyn let the silence settle, allowing the courtroom to fill the space with the implication. An officer admitting that bias, even subconscious, guided his actions. That admission, unspoken though it might seem, carried enormous weight. The gallery reacted. Some leaned forward, sensing the revelation in progress. Others shifted uncomfortably, aware that institutional trust was being questioned. Knox's attorney, Halle, attempted to interject again, but Evelyn raised her hand, her eyes never leaving Knox. "No further interruptions," she said. "The court seeks clarity, not deflection." Ha sank back, recognizing that the courtroom's dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Knox was now the one on trial in the court of public perception. Alicia then presented new evidence, a series of text messages between Knox and another officer involved in previous arrests of black men under questionable circumstances. The messages revealed a casual, almost flippant discussion of targeting specific individuals based on appearance rather than probable cause. Knox's attempt to deflect responsibility crumbled under the weight of written, time-stamped communications. Even Hale's most seasoned rhetorical strategies could not reconcile Knox's pattern of behavior with his claim of procedural adherence. Noah's supporters in the gallery exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. They understood that legal battles were unpredictable, and yet today's proceedings had shifted from conjecture to documentation, from assumption to revelation. Evelyn's methodical approach had peeled back layers of authority and exposed the human flaws beneath. Knox, despite his uniform and badge, was increasingly isolated by the incontrovertible evidence. The reality of accountability was closing in, and the implications extended far beyond a single arrest or a single defendant. By the end of the session, Evelyn called a recess to allow both sides to regroup. The day had been intense, filled with confrontation, testimony, and documentation that exposed not just Knox's misconduct, but a broader institutional failure to act against repeated bias. As the courtroom emptied, Evelyn remained seated momentarily, contemplating the next steps. Knox's pattern could not be ignored, and the court needed to confront the systemic issues alongside the individual case. Justice required more than a verdict. It demanded transparency, accountability, and the courage to challenge entrenched norms. Evelyn understood that she was now navigating a battle far larger than a single arrest. The integrity of the court and the principle of equal protection under the law were at stake, and she would not allow fear, prejudice, or habit to dictate the outcome. Outside, reporters and spectators lingered, sensing the gravity of the proceedings. News outlets would frame today's session as a clash between authority and accountability, but Evelyn knew the story was a deeper one that would resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. Knox's decisions, driven by bias and shielded by a system reluctant to act, were being exposed for the first time in a manner that left little room for denial. The courtroom had become more than a venue. It had become a stage for systemic reckoning, and through it all, Evelyn Marston remained focused, resolute. Her gavel, once merely a tool of procedure, had become a symbol of scrutiny and power, the power to confront misconduct, challenge privilege, and, if necessary, dismantle the illusions of authority built on bias and fear. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. Knox could sense it. Noah could feel it. The entire court could see it. And Evelyn knew that tomorrow the confrontation would escalate, revealing even deeper truths that Knox had hoped would remain hidden. The following morning, Courtroom 9B hummed with an almost electric anticipation. Word had spread through local media about the previous day's revelations, and a tension hung in the air thick enough to touch. Reporters crowded the benches, their cameras strategically positioned, capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama. Knox entered with a calm exterior, but Evelyn noted the subtle rigidity in his posture. His confidence from previous days had been chipped away by incontrovertible evidence and the scrutiny of the public eye. Even seasoned officers can crumble under the weight of proof, and Knox was beginning to feel that pressure. Noah, meanwhile, appeared resolute. There was a quiet dignity in his posture, an unspoken message that he would not be intimidated or broken. Alicia Voss, his attorney, moved with precision, guiding him with gentle but firm gestures, ensuring that his testimony remained steady, grounded, and compelling. Evelyn opened the session with a firm statement that set the tone for the day. We are here not merely to adjudicate an isolated incident, but to examine patterns of conduct that affect public trust, individual rights, and the integrity of this court. The weight of her words settled on every person in the room. Knox shifted uneasily, sensing that the proceedings were no longer solely about procedural arguments or conflicting accounts. This was becoming a public examination of character and accountability, one that could not be dismissed or ignored. Alicia began presenting further evidence, a compilation of prior complaints against Knox, cross-referenced with arrest records, internal investigations, and witness statements. Each complaint, when viewed in isolation, could be minimized, dismissed, or brushed aside as coincidence. But together, they formed a roadmap of bias, overreach, and misconduct. One particular incident from 2 years prior was especially damning. Knox had arrested a young black man for loitering outside a convenience store, claiming suspicion of theft. Video footage later revealed that the man had been waiting for a friend, had no stolen goods, and was entirely compliant with the police when approached. Internal reports noted Knox's behavior as aggressive and unwarranted, but the case was closed without consequence. This evidence painted Knox not as a lone officer making mistakes, but as a figure systematically abusing his authority. Evelyn called Knox back to the stand. His movement was precise, mechanical, lacking the subtle arrogance he usually displayed. "Officer Knox," she began, "we have documented prior incidents where your conduct toward black men has resulted in questionable arrests and unnecessary force. How do you justify your actions in light of this pattern?" Knox swallowed hard, attempting to frame each instance as judgment calls made in the line of duty, yet the detailed records, witness testimonies, and video footage undermined every excuse. Evelyn allowed a pause, letting the court absorb the gravity of his responses or lack thereof. Then she shifted focus to a more personal line of questioning. "Officer Knox, during your radio communication on the night of Mr. Carter's arrest, you identified him by race before confirming any criminal activity. Can you explain why this detail was necessary?" Knox faltered, the words he had rehearsed in his head slipping from his mind. It was for identification," he said, voice weaker than intended. Evelyn pressed on. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Carter's race influenced your decision to engage him, your level of suspicion, or your approach?" Knox hesitated, a fleeting flicker of discomfort crossing his face, then stammered, "I followed procedure." Evelyn's gaze did not waver. In that courtroom, the ambiguity was gone. His claim of procedure could not erase the premeditated bias captured on tape. Silence settled over the room, punctuated only by the faint hum of recording devices and the scratching of pens in the press gallery. Noah's own testimony followed, recounting the sequence of events with clarity and calm. He described how Knox approached aggressively, shouted commands, and escalated the situation without cause. He detailed his compliance, his efforts to de-escalate, and the unnecessary force used against him. The contrast between Noah's composed, factual narrative and Knox's defensive, often inconsistent statements was stark. Evelyn observed Knox closely, noting the subtle signs of agitation, a tightening jaw, shifting in his seat, and occasional flashes of frustration. These small details, though easily overlooked by an untrained eye, spoke volumes about Knox's recognition of his own vulnerability in the situation. Alicia then presented additional evidence, a series of emails between Knox and his colleagues, revealing a pattern of casual references to finding trouble among certain demographics. Knox had discussed previous arrests, and a tone that suggested bias was not only present but accepted among peers. Hawley attempted to argue that the emails were misinterpreted, Yet Evelyn's precise questions and the clarity of context left no room for reasonable doubt. Knox's expressions darkened with every piece of evidence laid bare. His attempts at justification sounded increasingly hollow. The courtroom was witnessing not merely an individual's misconduct, but the systemic enablers that allowed such behavior to persist. Evelyn concluded the morning session by emphasizing the larger stakes. This court is tasked not merely with evaluating a single arrest, but with understanding the broader implications of bias in law enforcement. We are here to ensure that no one, regardless of race, is subjected to injustice based on preconceived notions or unchecked authority. The weight of her words resonated across the room, signaling that the case had shifted from procedural adjudication to a deeper examination of ethics, accountability, and institutional integrity. Knox's carefully constructed persona, once confident and untouchable, was visibly strained. For the first time, he faced not just a verdict, but the broader consequences of exposing a long-standing pattern of discriminatory behavior. Outside the courtroom, the media was already buzzing. Headlines would frame the day as a dramatic showdown between law enforcement and individual rights. But Evelyn knew the reality was far more complex. This case was not simply about Knox or Noah. It was about the precedent being set for future interactions between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. Every detail, every piece of evidence, and every statement carried the potential to shift public perception and policy. Evelyn felt the weight of that responsibility keenly. Justice, she reminded herself, required courage and precision, not merely adherence to precedent or procedure. She had set the stage for confrontation, and tomorrow would demand even more courage, from herself, from Noah, and from the system itself. As the court recessed for the day, Knox left with a tight-lipped expression, flanked by his attorneys. Evelyn watched him go, her mind already calculating the next phase of proceedings. She would pursue patterns, corroborate witness testimony, and challenge every evasive argument. Knox had assumed he could manipulate perception and rely on institutional inertia, but Evelyn had demonstrated that evidence, truth, and meticulous preparation could dismantle even the most entrenched defenses. Noah, meanwhile, departed with cautious optimism. The long night of humiliation and fear had begun to give way to the first glimmers of vindication. For the first time, he felt that justice might not be an abstract ideal, but a tangible outcome. Evelyn remained in the courtroom, alone for a moment, reviewing the day's proceedings and anticipating the next steps. Knox's behavior, the documentation, and the witness statements formed a mosaic of accountability that could not be ignored. The fight was far from over, but momentum had shifted. Each piece of evidence was a strike against impunity. Each testimony a brick in the foundation of systemic reform. Evelyn knew that when court reconvened, the confrontation would escalate, revealing even deeper truths about Knox, the department, and the culture that had allowed bias to fester unchecked for years. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her, and she was ready to bear it. The following morning, courtroom 9B felt different. The anticipation was palpable, almost suffocating. Word had spread through media outlets that Officer Knox was being scrutinized not just for a single arrest, but for a pattern of misconduct spanning years. Journalists crowded every corner, some standing in doorways, others perched on benches, all waiting for the story to unfold. Knox entered with deliberate steps, shoulders squared, but Evelyn noted the subtle tension in his stride. The once unshakable confidence now carried the faint tremor of uncertainty. Noah, sitting beside Alicia, exuded a quiet composure. The events of the past days had worn him thin, but they had also reinforced a sense of purpose. He was not just fighting for himself, but for every person Knox had targeted unfairly over the years. Evelyn began the session with deliberate authority. This court will now hear further testimony and review additional evidence pertinent to the actions of Officer Bradley Knox, We are here to establish truth, accountability, and adherence to the principles of justice. The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. Knox's attorney, Hale, exchanged a glance with him, mouthing reminders about procedure and framing arguments. Knox nodded mechanically, but Evelyn could sense the growing fragility in his demeanor. The evidence against him had been methodically assembled, leaving fewer and fewer avenues for deflection. Alicia called the first witness, a former colleague of Knox's named Marcus Fields, who had observed Knox's behavior on multiple occasions. Fields testified that Knox routinely approached black men under the assumption of guilt, often escalating situations unnecessarily. He recounted specific incidents in detail, each one corroborating patterns seen in Noah's case. Fields described how Knox would manipulate documentation, exaggerate narratives, and frame compliant individuals as uncooperative or aggressive. His testimony painted Knox not as an overzealous officer acting in isolation, but as someone whose conduct had been calculated and systemic. Evelyn listened closely, noting the subtle tremors in Knox's hands as he gripped the edge of the witness table. Next, Evelyn turned to cross-examination. "Officer Knox," she began, her voice calm but sharp, "you have been presented with multiple instances where your actions toward black men have resulted in unjustified arrests or the use of excessive force. How do you reconcile these patterns with your stated commitment to public safety and procedural integrity?" Knox's jaw tightened, his eyes darting briefly toward Hall for reassurance. I acted according to my training," he said, but the conviction was thin. Evelyn pressed further, her gaze unwavering. "Did your training instruct you to prejudge individuals based on race, to escalate situations unnecessarily, or to fabricate evidence to support an arrest?" Knox hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a man searching for air and water. "No, Your Honor. That was never the intent," he replied, but the evasiveness was palpable. Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch, letting the courtroom absorb the weight of his words or lack thereof. Then she introduced the final piece of evidence, audio from Knox's body camera during the arrest of Noah Carter, coupled with timestamps and contextual footage from across the street. In the recording, Knox's initial approach, tone, and commands were aggressive, disproportionate, and entirely unwarranted given Noah's compliance. The moment Knox mentioned Noah's race into his radio communication was clear, deliberate, and undeniable. Hale tried to argue that the audio was inconclusive, but Evelyn cut him off. "The evidence speaks for itself. We do not need interpretation when actions are clear and intentional." As the room absorbed the implications, Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her tone controlled but forceful. "Officer Knox, do you acknowledge that your behavior during Mr. Carter's arrest, as well as your prior actions documented through internal reports and witness statements, constitutes a pattern of racial bias and abuse of authority?" Knox's hands trembled slightly, his face pale. He looked at Hale, then down at the floor, and finally back at Evelyn. For the first time, the mask of unshakable confidence faltered. I never meant for anyone to be hurt," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession was halting, fragmented, but it was real. Evelyn didn't need dramatic theatrics. The courtroom felt the gravity of the admission. A murmur ran through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Knox's colleague shifted uncomfortably, aware that the walls of protection surrounding him were crumbling. Noah exhaled quietly, relief and validation washing over him. This was the first public acknowledgement of the injustice he had endured, and it was finally being recognized under oath. Alicia approached Noah, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Stay calm," she whispered. "The truth is on our side." Evelyn allowed the courtroom to digest the confession before continuing. "Officer Knox, it is the duty of this court not only to adjudicate the actions of the individual before us, but to uphold the principles of justice for the community affected." Your repeated conduct demonstrates a failure to adhere to the standards expected of law enforcement. Officers. Knox's gaze fell, and Hale opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn's gavel cut through the tension like steel. No further commentary until this court addresses the implications of your actions. The next phase involved reviewing Knox's history in the department, including previously dismissed complaints and reports. Each document revealed a disturbing pattern: complaints of harassment, racial profiling, and unnecessary force. Internal investigations had routinely cleared him, citing insufficient evidence or perception differences, but Evelyn highlighted the consistency across complaints, showing that a single officer should not have repeated similar misconduct without scrutiny. The evidence portrayed a man who relied on systemic inertia to protect himself while continuing to exert power unjustly over those he deemed suspect. Knox shifted again in his seat, the weight of realization pressing down. He had underestimated the meticulousness of the court, and the repercussions were now unavoidable. Noah, meanwhile, gave a final statement recounting the emotional and practical impact of the arrest. He described the humiliation, the fear, and the sense of betrayal, not only from Knox's actions, but from a system that allowed misconduct to persist. His words were measured, heartfelt, and precise, resonating with everyone in the courtroom. Evelyn observed the jury, the gallery, and Knox himself. The combination of testimony, video, audio, and confession had formed an undeniable narrative. Knox could no longer claim innocence, and the court had successfully exposed a pattern of systemic bias that demanded accountability. By the end of the day, Evelyn adjourned the session with a statement emphasizing the broader implications of the case. This court has not merely addressed an isolated incident. We have examined patterns of conduct that undermine trust, perpetuate bias, and violate the principles of justice. The responsibility of this court is to ensure accountability, transparency, and adherence to the law. The next session will determine the consequences for Officer Knox and establish a precedent for the treatment of all citizens under the law. Knox left the courtroom silently, his uniform still immaculate, but his aura diminished. Noah walked out with Alicia at his side, a sense of vindication settling in his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but the trajectory had shifted irrevocably in favor of justice. The following morning, courtroom 9B was tense with anticipation. News of Knox's partial confession and the overwhelming evidence presented had spread like wildfire through the city, and a sense of historical weight hung over the proceedings. Evelyn Marston, seated at the bench, exuded calm authority, but she knew that the next steps were critical. This session was about formal accountability, about translating revelation and confession into action that could affect both Knox and the broader department culture that had shielded him. The gallery was packed, the media intensely focused, and Noah sat with Alicia, his eyes steady, reflecting a quiet determination born from months of uncertainty and injustice. Evelyn opened the session with measured words. This court is convened to consider the findings against Officer Bradley Knox, whose repeated misconduct and racially biased actions have been thoroughly documented, corroborated, and admitted. She paused, scanning the courtroom. Our task now is to establish accountability and ensure that such conduct does not persist within the department or the community at large. The emphasis on systemic responsibility was deliberate. Evelyn understood that punishing Knox alone was insufficient. The structures and attitudes that allowed him to act with impunity needed to be addressed. Knox sat rigidly, every muscle taut, as the weight of the courtroom scrutiny pressed upon him. The session began with the introduction of internal affairs records, highlighting Knox's prior incidents. Each complaint, previously dismissed as unsubstantiated, was reviewed and examined against the documented patterns now revealed through video, audio, and witness testimony. The cumulative effect was undeniable. Knox had repeatedly abused his authority, often targeting Black men under flimsy pretenses, escalating minor situations, and falsifying reports to justify unnecessary arrests. The evidence presented a mosaic of misconduct so consistent that any argument of coincidence or misinterpretation was untenable. Knox's defense attorney, Hawley, attempted to frame the complaints as isolated misunderstandings, but Evelyn's precise questioning exposed the fragility of such claims. "Mr. Hawley," she said, "we are examining patterns, not isolated incidents. Patterns demonstrate intent and accountability." Evelyn then addressed Knox directly. "Officer Knox, you have admitted that your actions toward Mr. Carter were influenced by racial bias. You have also been confronted with a pattern of similar misconduct over several years. How do you reconcile this with your duty to serve and protect impartially?" Knox's gaze dropped to the floor. His voice, when he finally spoke, was subdued and fragmented. I failed. I did not consider the impact. His words stumbled over one another, revealing the internal acknowledgement of wrongdoing that had been absent before. The courtroom felt the weight of the admission. Confession, when paired with documented evidence, was more damning than argument or accusation alone. Next, Evelyn turned to the matter of consequences. She highlighted the need not only for disciplinary action against Knox, but also for departmental reform. She called for testimony from senior officers and policy experts, questioning them on training procedures, oversight mechanisms, and how systemic failures had allowed repeated bias to persist unchecked. Each response reinforced the point. Knox's behavior was symptomatic of broader cultural and institutional failures. Officers had repeatedly overlooked complaints, investigations were superficial, and accountability mechanisms were weak. Evelyn's line of questioning exposed a system that had tacitly permitted misconduct, making the need for structural reform undeniable. Noah watched, a mix of relief and apprehension in his expression. While Knox's personal accountability was crucial, Noah understood that the ultimate goal was broader justice. The courtroom proceedings had already revealed a network of complicity that extended beyond one officer's actions. Evelyn was not only judging Knox, she was challenging the very culture that allowed bias to persist. Every witness, every document, every piece of corroborating evidence reinforced this narrative, making the eventual outcomes about more than just a single man in uniform. Then came the moment of formal acknowledgement. Evelyn instructed Knox to stand and read aloud a prepared statement of acknowledgement. His voice was low, hesitant, but clear. "I acknowledge that my actions were influenced by bias, that I have harmed Mr. Carter, and that my conduct does not reflect the standards expected of a law enforcement officer. I accept responsibility for my actions and the consequences that follow." The courtroom absorbed each word, the air heavy with the gravity of accountability. Knox's admission, though compelled, marked a turning point, the moment where denial could no longer shield misconduct, and the truth had been fully revealed. Evelyn allowed a brief recess before moving into the discussion of formal penalties. She emphasized that the court's role was not only punitive but corrective, aimed at preventing recurrence. Recommendations included termination, suspension of benefits, mandatory retraining, and an internal review of the department's handling of prior complaints. Each measure was designed to ensure that Knox's misconduct was neither excused nor repeated, and that the department faced the systemic scrutiny necessary to uphold public trust. The balance between individual accountability and systemic reform was delicate, but Evelyn navigated it with precision, aware that both were essential to restoring faith in the institution. As the session concluded, Evelyn addressed the gallery. "Let today serve as a reminder. No individual is above the law, and no institution should shield misconduct from scrutiny. Justice requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth." Her words resonated beyond the courtroom walls, signaling to the public that accountability was achievable, even against entrenched authority. Knox exited quietly, his demeanor subdued, knowing that his career and reputation had been irrevocably altered. Noah walked down alongside Alicia, a sense of vindication settling over him. Though the process had been arduous, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the steps toward reform represented a significant victory, not only for him, but for all those impacted by similar abuses of power. Outside, reporters clamored for statements. Alicia and Noah remained composed, offering measured words about accountability, systemic reform, and the importance of justice. Evelyn, meanwhile, retreated to her chambers briefly, reflecting on the magnitude of the proceedings. Knox's exposure was only the beginning. The real work ensuring institutional change, monitoring enforcement policies, and protecting citizens from bias lay ahead. Today marked the tipping point, a moment where truth had been brought into the light and where courage had triumphed over concealment and fear. The case had become more than a courtroom battle. It had transformed into a catalyst for change. Knox's misconduct was undeniable. His confession cemented the narrative, and the implications for the department were far-reaching. Evelyn Marston had demonstrated that thorough preparation, unwavering commitment to justice, and careful strategy could confront even deeply entrenched authority. For Noah Carter, the personal vindication was profound. For the city of Ravenshade, the proceedings set a precedent. Systemic bias could be exposed, and accountability was possible when truth was pursued relentlessly. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 9B, casting a stark light across the polished wood and marble. It was the final day of proceedings, and a solemn energy filled the space. Reporters and spectators had arrived early, sensing the conclusion of a case that had captivated the city. Evelyn Marston, seated at the bench, exuded a calm authority that belied the intensity of the past week. Today was about resolution, about ensuring accountability, formalizing consequences, and demonstrating to the public that the principles of justice extended to all, regardless of rank or uniform. Evelyn began by summarizing the proceedings to date. She recounted the damning evidence against Officer Knox, video footage of the arrest, audio recordings capturing biased language, witness testimonies detailing repeated misconduct, and the confession Knox had made acknowledging racial prejudice. The cumulative weight of these facts painted an undeniable narrative. This court, Evelyn stated, has established that Officer Knox repeatedly abused his authority, targeted individuals based on race, and undermined public trust. The responsibility now is to ensure that accountability is not symbolic, but effective. The room was silent. Even Knox sat with a tense composure, the facade of control finally stripped away. The first order of business was the formal ruling on Knox's employment and disciplinary status. Evelyn outlined the court's recommendations: immediate termination from the police department, revocation of any special privileges or benefits, and permanent notation of misconduct on his professional record. These measures were designed not merely to punish, but to prevent him from repeating the same harmful behavior in the future. Knox's defense attorney, Hale, attempted to argue mitigation based on years of service and isolated intent, but Evelyn countered decisively: intent cannot override impact. Repeated misconduct, bias, and abuse of authority cannot be excused by tenure or previous commendations. Knox's shoulders slumped slightly. The reality of consequence had fully arrived. Next, Evelyn addressed systemic reform within the department. She called for a comprehensive review of training, oversight procedures, and complaint investigations. Policies that had allowed Knox's pattern of behavior to continue unchecked would be scrutinized, with mandatory transparency and accountability measures implemented. Witnesses, including senior officers and policy experts, testified to deficiencies in supervision, the lack of meaningful follow-ups on complaints, and cultural pressures that discourage whistleblowing. Evelyn guided the discussion meticulously, ensuring that the court's focus remained on structural reform, not just individual punishment. The public, observing through media coverage, began to understand that justice required addressing both personal accountability and institutional responsibility. Noah Carter, seated in the gallery, absorbed the proceedings with a profound sense of closure. The fear, humiliation, and uncertainty he had endured were being acknowledged, not only through Knox's admission, but through the court's deliberate, systemic approach. Alicia whispered words of encouragement, reminding him that while one person's vindication could not erase the emotional toll, it could signal change for others subjected to similar treatment. Noah felt a mix of relief, empowerment, and cautious optimism. The court had recognized the injustice, and the mechanisms for reform were being implemented. The long fight had brought tangible results. Evelyn then allowed Knox to make a final statement. His words were halting, reflective, and devoid of deflection. "I acknowledge my actions," he admitted, voice low but audible throughout the courtroom. "I have caused harm, and I understand that my behavior was wrong. I accept the consequences and hope that my failures serve as a lesson for others in law enforcement." The confession, delivered with visible discomfort, underscored the impact of the court's meticulous process. Knox's acknowledgement, while incomplete in moral redemption, marked the first step in public accountability. After Knox's statement, Evelyn addressed the courtroom one final time. "Let this case serve as a reminder that no individual, regardless of position, is above the law. Justice is not simply about punishment. It is about ensuring fairness, transparency, and protection for every citizen. It is about holding institutions accountable and creating systems that prevent bias and misconduct from persisting. Today, we have achieved a measure of both individual and systemic accountability." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the gravity of the moment, while spectators absorbed the significance of the court's firm stance. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving an almost sacred quiet. Evelyn lingered for a moment, reflecting on the case. Knox's exposure had been significant, but the larger victory was systemic, demonstrating that meticulous evidence, unwavering commitment to truth, and strategic legal precision could confront and dismantle entrenched misconduct. The implications extended beyond Noah Carter and Officer Knox. The proceedings had set a precedent, a roadmap for future cases involving bias, abuse of authority, and systemic failure. Evelyn understood that justice was an ongoing process, not a singular event, and today marked a turning point. Outside the courthouse, Noah and Alicia stepped into the late afternoon light. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, and reporters clamored for comments, but Noah remained composed. "Justice isn't just about me," he said quietly. "It's about every person who's been afraid, silenced, or harmed by those meant to protect us. Today, we made a statement that matters." Alicia nodded, pride and relief in her eyes. Together, they left the courthouse, walking with purpose, their steps echoing the significance of the day. The battle had been arduous, but truth had prevailed. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to her chambers, alone with her thoughts. She reviewed the day's rulings, the implementation plans for departmental reform, and the meticulous documentation of Knox's misconduct. There was a sense of completion, tempered by the understanding that vigilance was essential. Systems could always fail, and bias could resurface if unchecked. Her role as a judge was not only to oversee cases, but to ensure that justice, fairness, and accountability remained active forces in the community. Knox's downfall was a victory, but the larger victory was the precedent it created. That truth, carefully pursued and systematically presented, could hold even the most entrenched authority accountable. As evening fell, Evelyn looked out over the city of Ravenshade. The courthouse steps, once merely a symbol of civic ritual, now felt like the epicenter of meaningful change. Knox's misconduct had been exposed, Noah's truth had been validated, and systemic reforms were underway. The day had demonstrated that courage, precision, and persistence could confront bias, reveal injustice, and create tangible change. Justice in its truest form had been achieved. And for Noah, Evelyn, and the citizens of Ravenshade, this day would be remembered not just as a courtroom victory, but as a turning point, a reaffirmation that integrity, truth, and accountability could prevail against fear, prejudice, and entrenched authority. Knox had been exposed, systems were being reformed, and the message was clear: no individual is above the law, and justice belongs to those willing to pursue it relentlessly. In the quiet aftermath, a city breathed a little easier, knowing that fairness and vigilance had triumphed, and that the scales of justice, long tipped, were being set right once more.